welcome everyone to the OLLI Medical Series, where we try to increase your medical knowledge in different areas that are related to the senior population. Tonight we have Dr. Jesse Borelli, PhD, talking about the stress of handling family relations in the COVID-19 world. Jesse Borelli, PhD, is a clinical psychologist specializing in family relationships and mental health. Dr. Borelli is an associate professor of psychological science at UC Irvine, where she directs Thrive, the Health, Relationships, and Interventions Laboratory. Navigating family relationships was already complicated before COVID-19 pandemic, but personal relationships have gotten really shaken up as a result of this world event. In this lecture, Dr. Borelli will provide a framework for the understanding of the many ways in which family relationships may have been affected by the pandemic, and will provide some tips for managing complex relationship dynamics that have emerged as a result of this turmoil. Okay, Dr. Borelli, would you like to take over the screen?
Thank you guys for having me. I'm very happy to be here. Okay, you guys can see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk to you today about probably what you're living and experiencing. So in some ways, I think we're all kind of the experts on what I'm going to talk to you about. So you can feel free to weigh in kind of at any point while I'm talking to share what your observations are, what your questions are related to what I'm talking about. So I think that in a lot of ways, I'm drawing a little bit on some research that's been done and some on theory, but a lot just on observations, right? Because we're kind of in a living laboratory right now in terms of what we're seeing. I am going to draw, on past research and what we know about what happens during crises and things like that. So first, I want to kind of just set the stage in terms of how important relationships are for human functioning and what we know as psychologists and mental health professionals in terms of just the broader context of what relationships contribute to health. So the theoretical framework that I'm kind of used to working with as a psychologist is attachment theory. And attachment theory says that close relationships are influential in human health from birth through death. The theorist who developed this theory, his name was John Bowlby, and he was a British psychoanalyst who was working kind of in the 1960s and 1970s. And he said that the desire to attach to another person or develop a really close connection to another person is as fundamental as the need to eat or to seek shelter from a storm or to run from prey. It's that strong and that fundamental and that kind of built in and hardwired. And his work, along with the work of other pioneering psychologists and behavioral scientists, including people like Harry Harlow, who demonstrated that things like contact comfort, if you're familiar with Harry Harlow's studies, he was working with primates. Contact comfort is more important in terms of soothing primates than food. For instance, the provision of food have shown us a lot about the importance of connection for humans and also for primates. And that need for connection is not just present in young children, which is what was originally thought, but now we know that it's actually hugely important throughout the entire lifespan, that we continuously throughout our lives are seeking connection and comfort, particularly during times of emotional distress or physical distress, but really throughout. And when we want to share joy with people, we're also seeking connection from other people. Okay, so just kind of to support this idea, I want to show you some data. This graph here depicts likelihood of survival. And what I've put up on the screen is a comparison between different types of things that we know are kind of healthy and predict long-term survival. So here, can you see my cursor, by the way? Moving?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so you can see here are different types of health behaviors. So we see, okay, like here's the flu vaccine, cardiac rehabilitation, exercise, physical activity, BMI. These are all things that we think of are generally good, generally healthy, generally going to lead to longer term survival, right? But the bars over here show how likely they are to lead to survival. And the bigger the bars, the more likely they are to lead to long-term survival. So what the biggest point that I want to just make here is look at the size of the bars for social relationships and look at how big they are relative to all these other kind of health behaviors that we think about as being so important. For example, smoking, or alcohol consumption, or getting the flu shot, or engaging in exercise, or BMI. The size of the bars for social relationships are much bigger. And another take-home point is that there's a 50% increased likelihood of survival for people who have stronger social relationships. The finding specifically was strongest for a measure of social integration, which is kind of how integrated you are into your community. So how many ties you have with different people throughout the community. And so I think while we tend to think of, if you go to the doctor, they always ask you things like, I just went to the doctor today, right? And they always ask every time, do you smoke? Do you drink? Do you use drugs? Are you exercising? And they never ask me about my social relationships, right? Never once have I gone to a doctor and they say, how are your social relationships? They did actually ask if I'm in an abusive relationship, but they didn't ask about, am I integrated into my social fabric, right? Do I feel a sense of social support from my environment? And actually what our research shows is that that might be more impactful than other types of health behaviors here. Similarly, this is another kind of health metric, cognitive functioning, which is really important for aging adults. If we think about like predictors of cognitive functioning, people talk a lot about physical health. We think about the importance of exercise in terms of predicting cognitive functioning over time. And depression is another factor that we think of in terms of predicting cognitive health or cognitive decline over time. But actually here, when you look at, this is the results of one study by a group in University of Arizona, they found that social participation is actually a much stronger predictor of cognitive functioning than either of those two factors, certainly very close to exercise, right? So just more evidence of the importance of social relationships in predicting one index of health. Okay, and the final point that I want to make is about something that I think has particular relevance to this moment in time, this historical moment, is about loneliness. Loneliness is the subjective experience of having a discrepancy between one's desired and perceived connectedness to one's social environment. And loneliness in particular is a very strong predictor of health outcomes. The picture here is of a psychologist named John Cacioppo. He passed away a few years ago, but he had spent the majority of his career studying loneliness. One of the things that has been shown is that actually in the past 5 or 10 years, there's been a dramatic increase in loneliness in the United States, so much so that the US government has started to dedicate a huge sum of money to studying loneliness and social isolation, because there has been a lot of research showing not only is there an increase, but there's also this tremendous tie between loneliness and health outcomes. And then that was before the pandemic, actually. But now we also know that the pandemic has started, and I'm going to admit this person. And the pandemic, of course, has only increased loneliness, particularly among younger adults, actually. Adults in their 20s have been hit the hardest by loneliness. But loneliness in particular is something when people feel that they're not understood by other people, that they're not getting what they want out of their social relationships. That's something we really need to strive to change. Okay, so that's just kind of a backdrop for, the importance of social connections and why we should care about these things. But now let's talk about what the past year has been like for all of us, probably. One of my colleagues in my department has referred to this year as a year of cascading traumas. And I think that's a really apt description. This last year has been characterized by anxiety, stress, grief, loss, changes in routines, changes in physical activity, really pronounced changes in social relationships. That's what we're going to talk about today. For many people who are working, changes in work environments, upheavals in political environments, basically everything we can think about has been changed this last year for many of us. So much so that it's been kind of a landscape that's been changing all the time, and we can't get used to anything that's going on around us. These things have been compounded by all the losses that we've had due to COVID and a lot of other issues. And there's been this pervasive threat of illness and loss surrounding us the entire time. When losses and traumas are happening like this, one after the other, on top of one another, it creates a situation where we can't even take time to kind of psychologically process the experiences that we're having. And one of the things that we know from the research literature is that a failure to process our experiences, trauma and loss, to persistent symptoms resulting from those experiences of trauma and loss. So being able to stop and process and take the time to resolve those experiences is related to better recovery from them. But when we can't do that, such as what's been happening to all of us within the past year, that's when problems start to arise. So those are reasons for concern. Trauma and loss impact us in these types of ways. They can cause sadness or grief, anxiety and worry, fear about our own mortality, big picture existential concerns like, does life even matter? Does is the world going to end? Big picture things like that. And then a feeling of hopelessness about the future, about mankind, about the goodness in other people, things like that. And these might be experiences that you have had over the past year, especially with all of these traumas compounding one another. And one of the things that has made this year in particular really hard is that the way in which we typically cope with experiences of trauma and loss is by turning to one another for comfort and support. So, but we haven't been able to do that this year. If you're lucky, then you maybe live with someone who you can turn to for comfort and support. If you have a partner or you have other family members or close friends that you live near or by, then you might be able to do that. But many people don't have that type of situation, and many people are separated from other people who they want to be able to turn to but can't turn to in the same way or to the same degree that they want to do that. So to kind of illustrate this point, I want to tell you about this really classic study that was done by this psychologist named Jim Cohn. He's a professor at the University of Virginia. And the study is really important within our field. He's actually done now kind of a series of studies that have built on this one study, but the study really proves the point of how important social support can be. You may already be familiar with this study because it's a pretty famous study, but he basically did the series of studies where he put people in an MRI scanner and that was monitoring their brain activity, their neural activity. And while they were in the scanner, he had them experience a series of shocks to their foot. And the shocks are painful. And so he'd give them like a shock and then another shock and then another shock, and the shocks would come, unpredictably at different times. And then there was an experimental manipulation that was involved in this experiment. So people would get different types of conditions. They would be randomly assigned to different conditions. And some of the people were in the condition where they would not hold anyone's hand. And some of the people were in the condition where they would hold a stranger's hand. This is while they experienced the shock. And some of the people were in a condition where they would hold their spouse's hand. I forgot to mention that they also, in addition to, so they were monitoring their brains while they were experiencing the shock. And they were also asking them after the fact, how painful was that shock? And the central findings from this study, like I said, he's done a series of studies like this, but the central findings that I want to talk about today are what the influence was of holding someone's hand, and in particular, holding your spouse's hand while experiencing those shocks. Does anyone want to take it?
No one's raising their hand, but if they want to just say, shout out something, please.
Well, for me, holding my husband's hand was constant comfort. Unfortunately, he's no longer with me.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I think I would experience that similarly. And you're absolutely right, because that's actually what the finding of the study is. Um, and I actually would be curious whether even imagining holding his hand might provide comfort for you, even though he's no longer physically with you.
Conceivably, he
Yeah.
was 6'5", and people always laughed because we held hands till the end.
That's wonderful. Yeah. So what he found was that the people who were in the spouse hand-holding condition reported the least amount of pain. And then next in line were the people in the stranger hand-holding condition. And the people who weren't holding anybody's hands reported the most amount of pain. And the findings where he looked at the neural activation of the region of the brain that processes pain matched that same kind of pattern of effects. And what was even more interesting was that he found that these effects were most pronounced among people who had high quality relationships with their spouses. Meaning that if you were someone who took a lot of comfort in your relationship with your spouse, like you had a high quality relationship, you had a stronger reduction, right? There were greater effects in terms of the attenuation of that perception of pain. And that's really important for those of us who are interested in relationships and who are interested in the regulation of emotion or the regulation of pain, physical pain, because what these findings tell us is that the presence of people, either the physical presence or maybe even the psychological presence of people, has a really profound impact on how we perceive our worlds or our experiences. And he, like I said, he's gone on to do a series of studies using this paradigm because it's a very useful paradigm for examining the impact of others on our psychological experience. But I bring up this study actually just to share how hard the situation is, and maybe how hard the situation is of the woman who just spoke, because when we don't have access to people, it really highlights how alone we are with our pain, because I think that our tendency is to reach for people. When we have pain, we want our people. We want our people because we are naturally comforted by people. And it works. Reaching out to other people works to downregulate that distress and discomfort. Okay, so when we can't turn to others, what do we do? How do we handle that kind of pain? And this situation with COVID has been, I think, particularly hard for people because of that reason. And you can tell me if you agree with this. During COVID, a lot of people have been in the situation of being unable to see and connect with other people. And I think that loss of connection is maybe punctuated or highlighted during situations when we're grieving or when we're experiencing joy and we want to celebrate. So during situations of heightened emotionality, when we really want to be with other people and share in our positive emotions or our negative emotions, and we can't be together, but probably also all the time. Okay, so what I wanted to now do is kind of transition to a part of the talk where I wanted to go through 10 different reasons why I think COVID has been hard on relationships, and then propose maybe 10 different kind of band-aids for those difficulties. And I do want to emphasize that I think they're band-aids. And by that, I mean, I don't think they're perfect solutions, because I don't think there is a perfect solution to this situation. I think this is a really hard situation. The first one is kind of what I was talking about already, which is that I think the number one reason why this whole situation is hardest on relationships and on families is because we're physically separated from most of the people we're in relationships with. And I think we're just not built that way to be able to handle that. I think that physical separation is really hard on relationships, and especially in the relationships where we're used to having physical separation, we hadn't developed tools for handling physical separation. We're now all of a sudden kind of thrust with no build-up period into a state where we have physical separation. So, we hadn't had time to establish routines for physical separation or systems of interacting with people. So, for example, when somebody moves across the country or across the world, and they're going to move across the world and then you're not going to have contact with them for a period of time, you usually put into place systems of like, how are we going to stay in touch? When are we going to see each other? You develop ways of maintaining a relationship that are going to be mutually agreeable for both parties, or at least ideally you do that. But this wasn't that kind of situation. There was no way to prepare for this. So there were no systems in place. And Zoom, I think we found, is not really a good replacement for that. It isn't three-dimensional. It doesn't involve hugs. It's difficult to have informal interactions. It's difficult to hang out and not talk. And I think that in a lot of ways, especially for people who are older, there is this technological divide that separates older and younger generations. You guys are all on Zoom, so you're all doing great. But I have a lot of older relatives who can't do Zoom and haven't been able to figure it out. And they've been really divided by younger generations. As my 7-year-old daughter said last year when she was 6, and we were driving to do like a drop-off wave, she was doing like a waving thing with her first grade teacher last year at the end of the year. She said, like, it just isn't the same when we can't hug our teachers. It's just not the same. I think that there just isn't really a good substitute for physical connections. So my solution for this is to use what we've got to power through this. And what I would suggest as one way to use what we've got is to rely on our memories. And here I'm going to be a little bit selfish and talk about my own research because I like it. And I'm going to talk about this technique that we've been developing in my lab over the past now 10 years called relational savoring. So relational savoring is kind of like savoring, like what it sounds like when you savor a good meal and you're eating something and you just kind of want to hold on to every ounce of what it tastes like. You want to like close your eyes so you can focus in on how good everything tastes and use all of your sensory focus to really hold on to that taste. That's what savoring is. Relational savoring is trying to do that about a relationship. And what I've developed in my work is a technique to try to teach people how to savor their relationships. And actually, I did a study a few years ago, and we recruited people from OLLI. This was before I was a professor at UC Irvine, but we came and we worked with someone who works with OLLI a little bit. I'm going to actually skip to that. Melanie Horan-Mallers. I don't know if you guys know her, but she has some connection to OLLI, and she helped us recruit people from, some of you may have participated in the study, I don't know. But we taught some people how to do relational savoring. And this technique basically involves picking a memory of a time when you felt really close or connected to someone and going through it and trying to kind of recall all of the different sensory details of the experience, and then how you felt emotionally during the experience, and what your thoughts were at the time, and then what that means about the experience, the fact that you had that experience, and then trying to hold on to it basically in every way. So let me skip back to this slide. This slide shows a relational savoring example from one of our other studies. It's a study of people who were in long distance romantic relationships. So a lot of our studies, we've done this with people who are physically separated from one another because we think it's a good time to do this kind of thing with people is when they can't be together. And we ask people to kind of try to pick out all the details they can pick out about the experience and just try to maximize everything they can get out of it. But I think this is actually a perfect opportunity when we're separated from people to try to really hold on to all of the positive experiences that we have had with people in relationships and try to get the most out of them. And I can tell you actually what we found in terms of relational savoring within older adults is what it says right there in the slide that you're looking at, is that it reduces physiological reactivity and enhances agency. And so let me tell you what that means. So we did a study a few years ago with people between the ages of 60 and 90, and we compared relational savoring versus when people were asked to savor a personal experience, meaning something they did on their own. These are some examples of things that people in our study chose to savor. So all kinds of different relational things. They chose things where they were taking care of other people or where people were taking care of them. And what we found is we measured their cardiovascular reactivity. In this case, it was their heart rate. And we found that people in the relational savoring condition had significantly lower heart rates than people in the personal savoring condition. These are standardized scores in case you're interested in the actual numbers. That's why they don't look like heart rate numbers. So it lowered cardiovascular reactivity as compared to their baseline scores. And then we also asked them at the end of doing this, we asked them to give advice. This was called an advice task. And we said, can you finish our time together by giving any advice that you feel is most meaningful? You can take as much or as little time as you'd like to think about this before responding. We're not looking for anything in particular, and there are no right or wrong answers. Just answer with whatever comes to mind after some reflection. And what we were looking for was how much sense of control or agency do people have when they give this life advice. So it's like advice for younger people living their lives. And we ended up taking these life advice kind of responses that people gave, and we transcribed them, what people said, and we coded them for agency and passivity. And agency is the extent to which you feel like you've got a sense of control over your life. And I've put here two different examples, one example that's low in agency and one example that's high in agency. And I know you can only see part of it, but I figured you would just kind of look at it a little bit. What we found is that the people in the relational savoring group gave responses that were higher in agency than the people who were in the personal savoring group. So just a little bit of data to show you that doing this relational savoring activity reduces your cardiovascular reactivity and it heightens your sense of agency. And I know from our other research, because we've done lots and lots of studies on this, it also makes you feel closer to other people. It makes you feel more positive emotion. It reduces your depression. It does all kinds of different things. So lots of reasons to do it. Okay. Reason number 2, why COVID is hard on relationships. In addition to being far away from people we want to be with, we're actually too close to some people we want to be away from. So the same people that we're close to, we just can't get away from them. So one example of that would be maybe the same person you married and got along fine with for 40 hours a week, you don't get along fine with for 100 hours a week. And that's just really hard. The same people, just like the same physical environments, can get really boring after a period of time. So my advice for this one is to try to go a little bit deeper or explore different parts of your current relationships to create different intimacy. Can you create more out of what you already have or change your relationships? This might be hard to accomplish, but I'm going to try. I'm going to give you some advice and you can see if it works. Here I'm going to talk about a study that was done by Art Aaron and his colleagues, where he showed that you can create closeness, feelings of closeness, using this procedure that he's developed. You may have heard about this. It was discussed in the New York Times. Now it's been 6 years since it was discussed in the New York Times. But what he did is he gave people a series of questions. It's called 36 Questions to Fall in Love. And the questions are basically designed to have people open up about their internal experiences. And if you put this, I'm happy to share my slides, by the way. And if you put this URL into your web browser, you will find these questions. But you'll see here are 3 examples of them. What would constitute a perfect day for you? If a crystal ball could tell you the truth about yourself, your life, the future, or anything else, what would you want to know? Or complete the sentence, I wish I had someone with whom I could share. And you can see they're all very personal questions, and they really ask you to kind of open up about your internal experience. I came up with some more that are maybe more COVID specific that you could ask your partner or someone you live with. What have you learned about yourself through this pandemic that you never realized before? Are there things that you have never really understood about yourself? Or what are the ways in which you want to grow over the next 10 years? So the idea would be to basically try to uncover with the person you're living with new parts of themselves that you haven't experienced before, and to have them try to do the same with you. That way you're learning about new things about them. Okay, the second, I think, challenging problem about living with someone is that there might be conflicts, lots and lots and lots of conflicts. So to deal with that, I wanted to talk about another brief intervention developed by a psychologist named Eli Finkel, who's a professor at Northwestern University. He's the author of a book called The All or Nothing Marriage, and he's also developed this intervention that I'm going to talk to you about here. So this is this intervention that he's taught couples to do, and it's fairly simple in principle. It might be harder to enact, but the basic idea is what I have on the screen here. He asks couples to think about their disagreements and to think about them, basically to try to step outside of them and to think about them from the perspective of a neutral third party. What he argues is that when we're in the middle of a disagreement, we're very much kind of enmeshed within the emotionality of it, and that it's very hard to see outside of it and to see outside of our perspective of it. But if we even describe it from start to finish as though we were watching it happen, as though we're not ourselves and we're kind of watching it happen from start to finish, that act of describing it from a third party perspective helps us get a degree of psychological separation from it that's really helpful, and that allows us to evaluate it from a more objective, removed kind of perspective. And what he's found is that if you do that over a 4-month period, he shows a reduction in conflict and an increase in relationship satisfaction. Okay, reason number 3. This is more outside of your immediate family. So now I'm moving towards difficulties that you have with people kind of maybe an extended family or friends. Okay, reason number 3, people have different preferences and needs for COVID safety. These preferences and needs often conflict with other people's preferences and needs. So let's just talk about a scenario. Let's say that you don't feel safe seeing your grandchildren until they're vaccinated, even though you are, because your grandchild has diabetes. But your son and daughter-in-law feel comfortable with it and want to visit you. They say that the grandchildren are dying to see you and can't stop talking about it. You're worried that something could happen and you could infect your grandchild, and you don't want to be responsible for that. So this is hypothetical. It may not apply to you, but hopefully you can see that there's a conflict here, and that's kind of the point I'm trying to get across. How do you resolve these differences of preferences? And I'm guessing that you've all kind of seen this, something like this come up, where there's been a difference in kind of one person feels safe doing this, another person doesn't feel safe doing this. How do you get to the point where you feel comfortable, or how do you make a decision about that? COVID brings up many new opportunities for conflicts. And they're hard to deal with. They're really hard to deal with for a variety of different reasons. I don't know that I know the answer of how to handle this, but I've thought a lot about what I would recommend, and I came up with a recipe, which I would recommend that you try, but I don't know if it will work, and you can tell me. My recipe is to first always express, no matter what, that you value the relationship with whoever you're talking to and that you want to connect with them. Because I think that one of the things that's always at stake within these conversations, whether or not it's said, in fact, I think it's often not said, but I think it's always at stake, is, do you really care about seeing me, or do you want to see me? I think there's an underlying feeling of rejection that's kind of always present. Maybe for you, maybe for the other people that you're talking to, but there's always kind of this, that's always kind of at play. So I think that if you upfront right away say, I really, really, really want to see you, and I've been dying to see you. And at the same time, there's this other concern, there's this other thing going on. I think it's helpful to inquire as to everyone's preferences for getting together, asking how comfortable everyone is with all these different facets that we're talking about. I think acknowledging that differences and preferences are expected, that they're natural, and having no value judgment placed any which way on these preferences. Everybody's dealing with different sets of circumstances, and that those determine what those preferences are. I think that can be a really helpful stance. And then I kind of recommend that you make a decision that's in line with the most conservative set of preferences that are present in any given group. So because that's going to be the least likely to offend or upset anybody that's there. That recipe may not work for every given situation, but I think it can work in many situations. Okay, I think reason number 4 that makes this thing hard, and it goes with reason number 3, is that people have difficulty talking about their COVID-related preferences and needs. And because people have difficulty talking about them, I think it makes making decisions harder because the conversations often don't happen. These differences in feelings or preferences are difficult to discuss and share. I think sometimes this happens because people don't want to hurt other people's feelings. And sometimes it's because people don't want to acknowledge the feelings and preferences of other people. Sometimes it's because people are unaware that other people have feelings that are different than their own. So all different kinds of things can cause difficulties in talking about these things. How you can help this is if you don't want to see your loved ones, or you don't want to meet someone outside, for instance, or you do want to meet someone outside, or let's say any kind of given thing, you want to express a preference that differs from somebody else's. That's kind of the idea I'm trying to get across. You can succeed in this by being direct and clear about what your preference is, saying the reason for your preference. So being direct and clear about that. Maybe it's that you have a personal health concern, or that you have a fear about something, you have a fear about being infected, or you have fear about something, and that it's not a concern that's specific to that person. So it's not because you're concerned that they have been unsafe, that they have been careless with their behavior, or etc. I think if the more you can own that concern yourself, the better. Saying it up front allows you to be there, to get there, and to also enjoy the interaction because you won't be distracted. And again, I think saying that you value the relationship is important too. That might also be an opportunity to ask them about what they want. And this has the added benefit of communicating that you value what they think and what they want. And then I already said about the valuing of the relationship. Okay, this one's also related to the prior ones, but people have difficulty accepting when other people have different COVID-related preferences and needs. I think one of the reasons why this might happen is that in a situation like this, where there's a lot of fear and threat in the air, and there's a lot of trauma in the air, people tend to want really clear right and wrong answers. And so it's very hard to entertain ambiguity. I think because entertaining ambiguity means that they might be wrong, or that they might not know the answer to a certain question, and that allows anxiety to creep in. When you do that, that allows anxiety to kind of creep into those spaces. And then I think that just opens them up to a lot of different fears. So I think it's much more, for certain people, I think it feels a lot better to be like, this is right, I have the right answer, I know what I'm doing, and your answer, if it's different than mine, is wrong for whatever reason. And so at least I've seen a lot of people doing that. I've seen a lot of people saying like, we're doing the right thing, the choices that we're making are right, and the choices that other people are not making are not right. And I think that it's a way of kind of almost like cutting off the cognitive processing of other choices, because other choices are threatening, or because it's threatening to leave the door open to think about other choices. Because right now there's a lot of fear and threat and scary things in the air. And I think many people just want to not think about all those things all the time. So I think that in a way, and I don't know if it's helpful to think about this, but for me, it's always helpful to think about this, that sometimes one of the reasons why people have such strong opinions or oppose other people's choices is actually a way of protecting themselves from having to deal with the discomfort of having to question their own choices. Of course, that's not an ideal way to be, but it may be a way of being that's protective. So if you want to counteract this, I think you can lead the way in the conversation by expressing that there are no right or wrong choices. around COVID. There are just better or worse choices for you or for your situation. You could say that everyone has different opinions on the situation and everyone makes decisions that are right or better or worse for them. And then I just gave some examples of how you could say that. If you want like sample statements for how to say that. You can also support the decisions that people are making, even if they're not yours. Like, I'm glad to see you weighing the evidence and making a decision that's good for you. Things like that. Okay. This is a pretty different kind of reason why COVID is difficult on relationships. But I think it's a big one. I think that right now it can feel like life is passing you by, you know? Relatives are having birthdays and bar mitzvahs and all kinds of things, and you're not getting to attend them, and things are just happening. And some people are going to events and you might not be, or maybe you are, I don't know. But the point is that for some people, I think things feel like life is just happening and you're not getting to be a part of it. You might have serious FOMO, fear of missing out, and you might feel really disconnected from friends and family, and that's a really awful feeling. I don't know that there's a great antidote for that, because I think that that's really challenging, and I think that it's really hard to feel like things are continuing and you're not a part of it. In my view, probably the best solution to that would be to share with people that you feel that way. If you tell them that you miss them or you long to be with them, it might make them reach out more. It'll let them know that you're feeling that way and make them aware of that, and maybe motivate them to try to connect with you. I also think it could be helpful to make, you know, a list of the things that you're missing and want to catch up on, and, you know, just so that you can keep track of them, and so that you might have a way of trying to either think about making up for it in a future year, or so that you're kind of just feel like you're almost like acknowledging for yourself what's happening and what you're missing. I also think, and some people have done a really good job of this, thinking of ways to compensate for the things that they are missing. Some of these are really creative. I think some things are hard to compensate for, and some things are hard, you just can't replace, but some things you can, like, you know, sending really creative care baskets or writing long letters. I think there are really good replacement ways to stay connected to people. This is related to that too, is not being able to celebrate good times with people. When good things are happening in your life, or there are good occasions, we want to be with other people. That's what we want to do, most of us. And not being together reduces the joy we feel. Everything else tends to feel like a poor substitute. It's pretty lonely to have a positive occasion and not be together, or to know that other people are having happy occasions and we're not there with them. It's a really hard feeling. And so my advice here is similar to the last one. I think it's okay to allow yourself to be sad. And one way to kind of do this that I think is helpful is to listen to sad music to allow yourself to get your feelings out, or keep a journal where you write things down, and make sure to focus on your feelings when you're doing that. And when you're done spending time doing some of those things to get your feelings out, then you can try to move on and think about how can you cheer yourself up. Maybe you can think about how you can take advantage of things that only happen this time of year. What are the things that you're not going to be able to do again when it's time to go out to celebrate whatever it is that you do out of the house, New Year's Eve out of the house, or Passover out of the house, or whatever, Thanksgiving. What are the things that you're going to miss actually about this year? So taking advantage of what you can do now. Okay. Relatedly, you can't share the hard times. Grief and loss and sadness are much easier when you're together with people, and depriving yourself of rituals makes loss seem less real, or makes your grieving unsupported. Here, what I think can be helpful is trying to identify what it is about the rituals that you value, and trying to take those elements and create something new. And I think, I don't know that this will work for everybody, but I think there are ways to try to think creatively about this. Probably most of you have dealt with some kind of funeral or some kind of loss this year. For me, my grandmother died in December, and we couldn't have a funeral for her. And so I was trying to think about, what did I want to do? And I was trying to think about what do I really value about funerals? And I think for me, it's less about the religion. It's more about really seeing family members and sharing like good memories and good stories about the person I love. And so I decided I was going to kind of take that quality or that kernel and make sure to call different relatives, set up like phone dates and call those people and share those stories and have good cries and like basically try to get out of those conversations what I would have gotten out of a funeral. And so that was kind of my antidote to that situation. Even though we couldn't have a funeral, I was able to get the same feelings and the same experience, or similar at least, out of doing it in a different way. And I think maybe some kind of similar recipe could apply to different situations if you can identify this is the piece, maybe not the whole package, but the crucial piece that matters to me most, that I'll miss the most if I don't have this ritual. And that's the piece that I'm going to try to transport into a different type of activity or ritual. Okay. Okay, I think reason number 9 that COVID is hard in relationships is that I think few people are at their best right now. Most people, older adults actually are, just so that you know, are in the group of people that are psychologically hurting the least in terms of mental health. So you guys may be in actually the group that's not doing the worst, but that being said, I think that most people are still, they're not doing their best right now. People are really stressed. Rates of mental health are really, really up. Stress levels are higher. Parents are working double time. And that makes it hard for other people to do anything more than kind of the basics. So it doesn't make other people good relationship partners, is my point. And that might make other relationships just really hard. So to kind of address that, I think that you have to make sure that you're doing things that bring you pleasure. And you can do those with other people, or you can do those by yourselves. And I would recommend doing pleasurable activities at least once a day. And we recommend scheduling these in. Just they could be really simple things, but just trying to make sure that you're doing something that brings you some kind of pleasure. I mean, even if they're small and simple things, at least once a day. And you can maximize the amount of joy that you feel if you really pay attention to how you're feeling before, during, and after, kind of like mindfulness-based way. Okay, here's just some data to show you the toll on mental health that COVID has taken. You can see here that even by June, there was a lot of mental health problems, and about 40% of adults reporting some kind of mental health problem. And here's another report that shows that there's triple the rates of depression post-COVID as compared to pre-COVID data. And there's just going to be more and more and more reports like this because the toll on mental health is just huge. Okay. Reason number 10 that this is hard in relationships, and this is maybe one of the more depressing ones, is that I don't think this is going to get totally better when the threat of infection is over. Because the more I think I'm seeing is that even when it's time to go back to interacting with people, I think people are going to have a hard time interacting. When we do go back, people are going to have forgotten how to interact, or may feel anxious about interacting, or I just don't think it's going to be over. A year without normal interactions doesn't pass without it having an impact. So how do we reduce anxiety about interactions is kind of the way we reduce anxiety about everything. Anxiety is a very physiological beast, and exercise is one of the best ways to combat it. Also deep breathing, meditation, yoga. if you can calm down your body, you usually can calm down your mind. And exercise and all of these tools can be used as prevention and also as intervention. When you're already anxious, it works to implement these things right away. But I also think that, I'm sorry, let me just skip to this one quickly and I'll go back. That if you can ease back to your life and your social interactions in a step-by-step, slow, progressive way, that's exactly what you want to do. Acknowledging that you feel anxiety while still kind of allowing yourself, encouraging yourself to ease back in, is really effective. You can pay attention to how you feel and what you're thinking and challenge your anxious thoughts, but encourage yourself to keep going. Going back to this slide, this actually is an op-ed right here that I had published in the LA Times back in May of last year. I was already worrying about people being anxious to resume normal life because I noticed that a bunch of my patients were really happy staying inside all the time. That was in May. And I was worried that when the world opened up, that their anxiety would have increased so much and they wouldn't want to leave the house. Because for people, especially people with social phobia, social anxiety, or agoraphobia, being inside and being in the house actually isn't that hard. It's much easier than leaving the house. But the problems were going to come when the world opens up again. Now that it's been, a full year that people have been inside, it's going to be that much harder. So what I actually predict is that when life goes back to normal, it's maybe going to be easier for about a third of people. For maybe a third of people, it'll stay the same. And maybe a third of the people, it'll be much harder. So in terms of mental health, I think what that means is that we need to be really vigilant about helping escort people back to health. Okay, so how do we protect our mental health and our relationships? I think we need to be focused on always having this mental health toolkit in mind, which we've already talked about all these. We need to be talking about our emotional well-being, reducing our anxiety, engaging in activities that are personally fulfilling, promoting our relationships and our connection, and working on creating new rituals. Okay. I think that talking about our well-being is part of just always we need to do that within our relationships, and always expressing feelings allows us to let them go. This is just a cute thing that one of my kids said that I thought I would show you because I think it shows how important talking about feelings is. And if a little kid can say it, then I think it's definitely got to be true. This is my 12-year-old, so not so little, but she says, I think it's harmful. This is about a school stressor. So to think that schoolwork, that you're not going to finish it and just be upset, do nothing about it, and like not talk to anyone, just keep it private, just have all your thoughts in your own head, not share anything, then it'll just build up and get worse. And I think it makes it a lot better if you tell someone or fix it right away and come up with a game plan. And similarly, she said, I feel like you should definitely talk to a trusted friend or adult, because like if somebody relates to you, then you feel like you're not alone. And also it makes your stress almost go away if you do that. And then my 7-year-old said, and this actually happened to me a bunch of times when I told my mom or anybody else that's very close to you, it's a very good strategy. And it makes me feel a lot better and it makes me feel safe. And like Sam says, it makes my stress like disappear. And if it has something to do with somebody else, then they like help me solve the problem and it helped like make it better for that person and you. So if you take it from the experts, from my kids, that's just more evidence that why we need people, why we need each other, why we need to talk about our feelings. Okay. And finally, I just wanted to end by reminding people that even though these prevention techniques are effective, mental health providers are always available too. That's the end of my talk.
So if you have any questions, you could raise your hand and ask your question, or you could type it in the chat and I'll read it off. I'll start it off then. What if the COVID routine of being shut in, away from people, having limited contact is your normal preferred way of life? That's how you were before.
Mm-hmm.
Do you foresee something like that being okay as you move out of the COVID phase? Do you think people will say, I should be getting out there, or should people just try to stick to who they are and be true to themselves?
I think if it was your normal routine before and it wasn't causing you problems, then I don't think that there's any reason to think that it, you know, that you need to change it. I mean, I think if you feel like there was something lacking um in your life, or this has made you aware that there was something lacking in your life, or it's made you aware of like um because so many people have been talking about it and talking about it as being so oppressive, that it's made you aware of, wow, everyone else thinks this is so oppressive. Why do I think this is okay? Then maybe could be interesting to experiment with something else. But I also think different people have different social needs, and needs for social connection, and different people and different needs for time alone. And um, there's it's like a bell curve in terms of how much social connection people need. So I think it's wise to follow your own desires in that way.
Okay. We have a question in the chat. How do you deal with family members that have become very negative politically, or in any way that people have really changed and become negative?
I guess I kind of want to know more about the context. Is it okay if I ask follow-up questions to the anonymous asker?
Sure.
Um, are they kind of like very vocal about their negativity, or are they withdrawn and negative?
They are very vocal about their negativity, and it's unlike their personality. That's not how they were before.
Mm-hmm.
And now they've come into a whole year of just a lot of negativity
Mm-hmm.
from the news, from conspiracy stuff, it's very strange. So most of the family is just watching and observing and not saying anything. But you want to kind of be careful, because they're going probably through their own process of dealing with this as well.
Yeah, I would be a little bit concerned about that person.
Yeah.
If it's been a real change for them, and if they're, I mean, it honestly would make me want to have a private conversation with them and ask them um, how they're doing personally. And if, I don't know if you feel like this person would be open to this kind of thing, how they would react to this, but if they're, how they're feeling emotionally, and if you can be a support to them.
Right. And I know, like, there's even people at the store that are negative, like all of a sudden will be negative, and you're like, oh my gosh, but you don't know what they're feeling and what their stresses are and what they're doing. So I think we all have to be really empathetic right now, especially coming out of this.
Definitely. And I think that a lot of times, like, when people are, for example, really depressed or really discouraged about things, one way of handling it is by projecting it to the outside world. And saying, I mean, and the outside world has had a lot of problems. So it's not like, there have been a lot of political problems. There have been a lot of, there's been a lot that's been criticism worthy in the last couple of years, right? But I think that, one way of kind of handling things is to put them all out there. But I think that sometimes that's a sign that there's just a lot of distress and inside. And maybe if you start a conversation about that, it would go somewhere.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Diane.
Right now for myself, because I've literally been in for a year all by myself with nobody coming in my house, not even a cleaning lady in that. And I did meet a friend, an OLLI friend today for lunch for a while, and we were talking about that. I still have some concerns about getting together and anything, but small groups or anything. But I happen to be one that I want to go back to school. I don't want to sit in front of Zoom all day, but it's saved my life having Zoom. My God, it gives us something to do, and it's been wonderful, and it gives us interface with people, even though it's not a live interface. At least we can talk to each other and do things and see that. But contrary, a lot of people don't want to come back to school, and I can kind of understand. They have more physical problems. It's more difficult for them to get to school, and they've gotten used to Zoom and with parking and everything else and with health problems. But I think overall, we as OLLI members are very social people. All you have to do is look around at the social activities we have, the people sitting outside under the umbrellas having lunch and talking. I don't think we're an introverted group of people. I think we're a very social group of people. So I don't see that as a major problem. It's just, we just have to overcome a few of the things that we have. Our life will never be the same as it was before, and not all bad. We can't look at it as being a negative. Like any major thing that takes place, there's always changes, and they are for the good. So I'm anxious. I'm anxious to get back. I'm not I don't mean anxious in the sense of being a person. I'm anxious to get back and socialize because I am a social person. But I've also been fine with it this way. I've just adjusted. I don't think I've been depressed one day or anything else. And it's just part of life. Oh, that's where I stand.
Okay, there's a question in the chat. You said that Zoom is a poor substitute for interaction. I've felt that Zoom has really been helpful to me for the past year. How can we work on Zoom and make it better?
I should clarify what I said, because I think I agree with what Diane was saying, and that I think that it's been wonderful and a lifesaver, like in many ways. I think that the way in which it doesn't facilitate casual interaction very well, is I think what's problematic. It facilitates like what it does very well is like either one-on-one interaction or very small group interactions, and where you're intending to have a conversation. Like what it doesn't mimic very well is like, let's get together and hang out for the afternoon, for instance. That type of interaction you can't do very well over Zoom. You can do it, but it doesn't like it's not ideal for that kind of circumstance where there's going to be like downtime and who's going to not talk, and like how do we handle not talking, for instance, and just hanging out. Or if multiple people want to talk and have side conversations organically, kind of how do you handle that? I think that that's just kind of hard. I went to a baby naming thing a couple of weeks ago, my brother's baby naming, and they did the little baby naming service, and then they're like, okay, now you can talk amongst yourselves, but really you can't talk amongst yourselves, because if one person talks, that's it. Like you can only have one person talking. And so nobody spoke, not a single person spoke. It was like 20 or 30 people just sitting there totally silent. And then we sat there totally silent for like 5 minutes. And then they were like, okay, well, we'll just end it. But it was such a missed opportunity, because there were 30 people there who were, all relatives or friends who don't see each other very often and wanted to see one another. But then I suppose there could have been breakout rooms, or they could have done something like that. There are ways that they could do that, but it's just, it doesn't mimic the same kind of party vibe, right? Where you can just mill about and have a conversation with someone, like you talk to someone for a few minutes and then talk to another person, and there are multiple people doing that at the same time, if that makes sense. I think that's what I've kind of commenting on, is that kind of organic, the way that social interaction can happen kind of organically that way that we can't do.
Okay, I don't see any other hands, so I'd like to thank you for attending tonight, everybody. And I'd like to thank Dr. Borelli for being here and talking to us and giving us some strategies to hopefully ease the transition over the next few months. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.